There was a place outside Jerusalem that no one visited unless they had to. Not a battlefield, not a prison, not a burial ground, though it had been all of those things. It was a valley, a narrow, shadowed gorge just southwest of the city walls, where the stone descended in jagged shelves and the air carried a heaviness that had nothing to do with weather. The locals called it Gehinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, and in the Greek that the earliest followers of Jesus wrote in, that name became Gehenna. When people read the Gospels today, they often encounter the word hell and imagine something from medieval paintings, a vast underground realm of fire and torment, complete with red-skinned demons and eternal screams. That image is real to millions of people, and it is powerfully felt. But it is almost entirely the product of centuries of artistic imagination, not the world Jesus walked in. The fear that ordinary people in first-century Judea carried when they heard the word Gehenna came from something far more immediate, far more concrete, far more rooted in the landscape of their own daily lives. And if you understand what that valley actually was, what had happened there, what still happened there, what every person in Jerusalem could smell on certain nights when the wind shifted, then the words of Jesus take on a weight and a texture that no English translation has ever fully captured. Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels forever. If this kind of deep historical journey into the world of the Bible is something you want more of, the kind that makes the text feel real and present, consider joining this community now. Every video here is built on the same foundation, the concrete world Jesus actually lived in. To understand Gehenna, you have to begin several centuries before Jesus was born. The Valley of Hinnom is first mentioned in the Hebrew Scriptures as a boundary marker, a geographical line separating the tribal territories of Judah and Benjamin. It appears in the book of Joshua simply as a piece of land, a ravine, a feature of the landscape like any other. There is no darkness attached to it yet. But then something shifts. In the books of Kings and Chronicles, the valley reappears, and now it carries a different meaning. The texts speak of Topheth, a site somewhere within the valley, where during the reigns of certain Israelite kings who had abandoned the covenant of their fathers, children were brought and offered to a god called Molech, the fire altar, the burning. Modern scholarship debates exactly what these rituals looked like, how widespread they were, and whether the biblical descriptions are precise accounts or polemical exaggerations meant to condemn political opponents. What is not in doubt is the way the memory of those rituals embedded itself in the consciousness of the people. The prophet Jeremiah, writing in the 7th and 6th centuries before Christ, stood at the edge of this valley and pronounced judgment in language that shook the soil beneath him. He declared that the valley would become known as the Valley of Slaughter, that the bodies of those who had forsaken God would lie there unburied, food for birds and animals, that no one would mourn them. Jeremiah was speaking into a specific political moment, the coming Babylonian invasion, the destruction of Jerusalem, the unimaginable catastrophe that was already rolling toward Judah like a wave. But his words sank into the valley. They became part of its identity. Long after the Babylonians came, long after the exile ended and the people returned and rebuilt, the Valley of Hinnom carried that weight. It became the place associated with fire, with judgment, with the bodies of those cast out from the community of the living. And over time, through the long centuries of the Second Temple period, the era of Persian and then Greek and then Roman domination, that association deepened and transformed. By the time Jesus stood on a hillside in Galilee and warned his listeners about Gehenna, the word already carried centuries of accumulated dread. But here is what matters most for understanding the fear it produced in ordinary people. Gehenna was not only a theological concept, it was also a place they could walk to, a place some of them passed near every day. A real valley with real smoke and real fire, a place where the refuse of the city was burned, where the bodies of criminals who had been executed and stripped of burial rites were sometimes thrown, where the smoldering never fully stopped. The smell of Gehenna was something people knew. When the wind came from the southwest and moved through the city gates and past the markets and into the houses where families were eating their evening meal, there was sometimes a faint bitterness in the air. The smell of burning that had no source visible from inside the walls. That smell meant something. It had always meant something. Consider what burial meant in the world of first-century Judea. This was not merely a religious obligation, though it was deeply that. Burial was one of the foundational acts of human dignity, the thing that separated a person from an animal, the thing that confirmed that a life had mattered, that someone had loved or mourned or at least acknowledged the body's passage from one state to another. The Mishnah, the great compilation of Jewish oral law, would later codify what many already understood, that burying the dead was a mitzvah, a commandment so important that even the study of Torah could be interrupted to perform it. To die and be left unburied was not merely an indignity. It was a kind of annihilation. It meant that no one had claimed you, that you belonged to no one, that your name had been cut from the living without ceremony. The Psalms are full of this fear, the fear of being cast into a pit with no covering, no stone, no one to say your name over your body. And Gehenna was the place where that fear became physical. When the Romans crucified a man, they did not, as a rule, permit his family to take the body. Crucifixion was a statement. The body left on the cross or thrown into a common pit outside the walls was part of the message. This person was nothing. This person belonged to no community. The state had spoken, and the earth had not answered. Some of those bodies ended in the valley. Some of them burned there. This is the soil in which the word Gehenna grew. There is a detail in the Gospel of Mark that most readers pass over without stopping. When Mark describes the aftermath of Jesus' death, that brief, shattering passage in which a man named Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate and asks for the body, the text uses a specific Greek word. Joseph asks for the soma, the body. But Pilate, when he responds, uses a different word, toma, the corpse, the fallen thing, the piece of discarded matter. It is a small detail. It takes less than a second to read past. But in the world of first-century Judea, the distance between those two words was enormous. One word belonged to the living, to people who mattered, who had families, who would be mourned and buried with hands folded and stones placed and prayers said over them in the last light of afternoon. The other word belonged to the valley. Pilate's word, the patoma, was the word of the executioner. It was the word that placed a human being outside the circle of the buried, outside the community of the dead, who were still, in some sense, held. It was the language of Gehenna, that Joseph of Arimathea asked at all, that he risked his standing, his relationship with the Roman administration, his own social safety. Only makes sense if you understand what the alternative was. Without his intervention, the body of Jesus would almost certainly have been disposed of in the manner the Romans reserved for executed criminals. Thrown, left. Burned, eventually, in the refuse that accumulated outside the walls of the city. The resurrection accounts in all four Gospels begin with an empty tomb. And the tomb is there because one man walked into the governor's hall and used the right word. But to understand why Gehenna produced the kind of fear it did in ordinary people. Not just criminals, not just the politically condemned, but farmers and merchants and fishermen and their wives and children. You have to understand something about the structure of first-century Jewish thought about death. The Hebrew Scriptures do not present a single unified picture of what happens after a person dies. The older texts, the Psalms, the early histories, speak of Sheol, a kind of dim underworld where the dead exist as shadows, without strength, without full consciousness, without connection to God. It is not a place of punishment. It is a place of diminishment. The dead in Sheol are not tortured. They are simply less present, less real, less alive in every sense that the Hebrew mind valued. But by the time of the 2nd century before Christ, during the turbulent period of the Maccabean revolt, when Jews were dying in large numbers for their faithfulness to the covenant, a new urgency entered the conversation. If people were dying because they refused to compromise, if righteous men and women were being killed while the wicked prospered and collaborated with the Greek overlords, then something had to account for this. Something had to make it right. The idea of resurrection, of bodily restoration after death, of a future in which the righteous dead would be raised and the unjust would face a reckoning, entered Jewish thought with new force in this period. The book of Daniel, the earliest clearly apocalyptic text in the Hebrew Bible, speaks of a time when many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Shame and contempt. Not hellfire yet, not in the later Christian iconographic sense, but something that rhymed with Gehenna, something that rhymed with being left unburied in the valley outside the walls. By the 1st century, the Jewish world held multiple, sometimes competing, sometimes overlapping frameworks for understanding death and judgment. The Sadducees, drawn largely from the priestly aristocracy, rejected resurrection entirely. The Pharisees, whose influence ran deeper in ordinary communities, affirmed it. Apocalyptic groups, like the community at Qumran, developed elaborate scenarios of cosmic judgment. And ordinary people, the farmers and fishermen who were not theologians, who had not studied in the great academies, who knew the Torah through the weekly readings in the synagogue and through the patterns of their lives. Ordinary people held a mixture of inherited instincts, half-formed fears, and very concrete associations. For them, Gehenna was not primarily a systematic doctrine. It was an image, a smell, a sound, the sound of fire that never fully went out. This matters enormously for how we hear Jesus. When he speaks in the Sermon on the Mount, when he tells his listeners that being angry with a brother makes one liable to judgment, that calling someone a fool makes one liable to the fire of Gehenna, he is not introducing a new theological category. He is reaching into something his listeners already carry in their bodies. He is naming a fear that has no need of explanation, because it lives in the landscape itself. The people listening to him on that hillside knew what the valley was. Some of them had smelled it. Some of them had walked close enough to the southern edge of Jerusalem to hear the sounds of burning on a still night. Some of them had lost relatives to Roman execution and had lived with the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing whether there had been a body, whether there had been a burial, whether the person they loved had been consigned to that place. Jesus does not explain Gehenna to his listeners. He does not pause and offer a theological footnote. He uses the word the way you use the name of something everyone already recognizes, a shared reference, a common weight. And that is precisely what makes his use of it so striking. Because he does not only use it as a threat, he uses it as a measure, as a standard against which to evaluate the small, ordinary, invisible sins, not murder, not theft, not the great public transgressions that everyone agrees are wrong. He is talking about contempt, about dismissal, about looking at another human being and refusing them their full weight as a person. Whoever says, "You fool," to his brother is liable to the fire of Gehenna. In a world where being cast outside the community of the buried was the deepest possible expression of being stripped of dignity, in a world where the valley represented not just death, but the denial of one's full humanity, to treat another person with contempt was to do to them, in miniature, what the valley did to the unburied dead. It was to refuse them their name. The tension that Jesus was navigating in these teachings was not abstract. First-century Judean society had very precise, very rigid systems for determining who mattered and who did not. Honor and shame governed nearly every social transaction. A man's standing in his community, his ability to do business, to have his word accepted, to give his daughters in marriage, to walk through the market and be greeted with respect, depended entirely on the collective judgment of the people around him. Honor was not an internal feeling. It was a public verdict, renewed constantly through small daily interactions and threatened constantly by the smallest visible failures. To call someone a fool, rasa, the Aramaic word that appears in Matthew's account of this teaching, was not simply to insult them. It was to make a claim about their standing. It was a form of social execution. To strip a person of their dignity in the presence of others was to begin the process of casting them out, to begin placing them, symbolically, in the category of the unburied, the discarded, the ones to whom no one owed mourning. Jesus understood this with perfect clarity. He had grown up in Galilee, in a small town where everyone knew everyone, where the hierarchy of honor and shame played out in every transaction at the well and every conversation at the gate. He had watched the people around him navigate these systems with the careful attention of those who cannot afford to make a mistake. And he stood on that hillside and told them that the same force which condemned criminals to the valley, the force of contempt, of dismissal, of refusing another human being their full weight, was operative in the small cruelties of daily life. The fire of Gehenna did not begin in the valley. It began in the heart. Walk through the lower city of Jerusalem on any ordinary morning in the first century, and you will encounter a world organized around distinction. Not distinction in the abstract philosophical sense, though the scholars and teachers argued endlessly about categories and classifications and the precise boundaries of covenant obligation. The distinction that structured daily life was simpler and more immediate than any of that. It was the distinction between the clean and the unclean, the included and the excluded, the ones who could enter and the ones who had to wait outside. Every gate had a threshold. Every courtyard had a boundary. The temple itself was organized as a series of concentric enclosures, each one more restricted than the last. The court of the Gentiles, giving way to the court of women, giving way to the court of Israel, giving way to the sanctuary where only the priests could enter. And beyond that, the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could go, once a year, on the Day of Atonement, with the names of the 12 tribes carried on his breastplate. The architecture of the temple was not merely aesthetic, it was a three-dimensional map of belonging. And the logic of that map extended outward into the streets, into the markets, into the houses, into the way people related to one another at every level of daily life. In this world, Gehenna occupied a specific position in the moral and social imagination. It was the ultimate outside, the place beyond all thresholds, the place where even the logic of belonging had ceased to apply. To feel the full weight of this, consider the lives of those who lived on the edges. The lepers, those afflicted with tzarahat, the skin condition that rendered a person ritually impure under the Levitical code, were required by law to live outside the settled community, to warn approaching travelers of their condition, to remain at a distance from the clean. Their exclusion was not primarily medical, though it had medical consequences. It was categorical. They had crossed a threshold, and the threshold could not easily be crossed back. The same logic applied, in varying degrees, to the blind, to those with certain physical impairments, to women during menstruation, to anyone who had come into contact with a corpse. These were not moral failures in the strict sense. They were states of contamination, conditions that disrupted the boundaries the community required in order to maintain its relationship with the sacred. And at the far end of this spectrum of exclusion, below even the lepers who at least retained their communal identity as displaced members of the people, were those for whom no return was envisioned: the executed criminal, the apostate, the person whose name had been formally separated from the community. These were the ones for whom Gehenna was not merely a metaphor, but a literal destination, the valley where the discarded went, where the fire waited, where no one came to mourn. Jesus moved through this world with deliberate, visible, repeated attention to exactly those people. He touched the leper. The Gospel of Mark records this with a precision that would have made every reader of that text flinch, not with disgust, but with shock. He stretched out his hand and touched him, not from a distance, not through a mediator. He reached across the boundary that the entire social and religious architecture of his world maintained, and he touched the man whose condition had made him untouchable. He ate with tax collectors, men who had placed themselves outside the covenant community by collaborating with Roman economic extraction, by handling Gentile coins, by operating in a system that made ritual purity impossible to maintain. To eat with someone in first-century Judea was not a casual social gesture. It was an act of solidarity, of mutual recognition, of shared belonging. To eat with the excluded was to challenge the map of belonging itself. He spoke publicly and directly to women, to Samaritan women, to women with histories of hemorrhage and ritual impurity, to women whose social position made them nearly invisible in formal religious discourse. Each of these interactions was, in its own way, a small act of re-inclusion, a hand extended across a threshold. This is the context in which his teachings about Gehenna become most fully intelligible. When Jesus warns his listeners about the fires of Gehenna, he is not primarily constructing a doctrine of afterlife punishment for the benefit of future theologians. He is speaking into a specific, present, operational system. A system in which certain people were already being treated as if they were outside the circle of the fully human, as if their dignity could be stripped without consequence, as if the fire of contempt could be directed at them without any accounting. The Pharisee who thanks God that he is not like the tax collector, that man is rehearsing in miniature the logic of the valley. He is performing a small Gehenna in his heart, casting the other man outside the boundary of those who deserve God's favor, those who deserve to be seen. The rich man in the parable who ignores Lazarus at his gate every day, who steps over the poor man's body without acknowledgement, without seeing him as a person with a name and a need, is practicing in his daily habits the same dismissal that the valley practiced on the unburied dead. And in the parable's reversal, it is the rich man who ends in torment, and Lazarus who rests in the bosom of Abraham. The map of belonging has been redrawn. Jesus uses the geography of his world, its actual, physical, smellable, visible geography, as the terrain on which he builds his moral vision. Gehenna is not a theological abstraction that he imports into his teaching. It is a real place that he takes up and turns. He takes the valley that his culture had made into the symbol of ultimate exclusion, and he holds it up like a mirror. Look, he is saying, look at what you are already doing to one another. Look at where that leads. There is a particular passage in the Gospel of Matthew, in the great discourse of judgment in chapter 25, where this logic reaches its fullest expression. The Son of Man comes in glory, and before him are gathered all the nations. They are separated as a shepherd separates sheep from goats. And the criterion of judgment, the thing that determines who goes where, is not doctrinal correctness, not ritual purity, not the precise observation of the law's 613 commandments. It is something far more elemental. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. The righteous are confused. They don't remember doing these things for the king. And he tells them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. The Greek word translated as least, elakistos, carries a specific social weight in first-century context. It doesn't mean merely the humble or the modest. It means the ones of lowest status, the ones with least honor, the ones closest to the threshold of exclusion, the ones who, in the social logic of the valley, were already halfway outside the circle of those who mattered. The judgment is not about theology. It is about whether, in the small daily moments when a person of no social weight appeared before you, you were able to see them as someone whose hunger was real, whose cold was real, whose imprisonment was real. To refuse them that recognition, to look through them as if they were already in the valley, is, in this account, the deepest possible failure. And the place assigned to those who failed is described with a phrase that echoes directly the language of Gehenna, the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. The vocabulary of the valley, the smell of the smoke, the place where those who treated others as refuse are themselves consigned. There is a moment in the Gospel of Mark, brief, almost parenthetical, that most readers pass over without recognizing its full weight. Jesus is in a conversation about divorce, about the law, about the technicalities of what Moses permitted and what God intended. And then children are brought to him and his disciples, acting with the protective logic of men who believe their teacher's time is valuable and his attention reserved for serious matters, begin turning the children away. Jesus is indignant. The Greek word Mark uses, agonaktesin, is not a mild word. It is the word for a sharp, visible, almost physical displeasure. He rebukes his disciples and takes the children in his arms. In a world organized around honor and status, and the precise calibration of whose time and presence mattered, children occupied a particular position. They had no honor of their own. They could not transact business, could not give testimony, could not hold property, could not stand in the assembly of the community as independent voices. They existed under the authority of their fathers in a system where authority and personhood were nearly synonymous. A child, in the social grammar of first-century Judea, was not yet fully inside the circle of those whose dignity required formal acknowledgement. And Jesus places them at the center. He tells his disciples that the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. He is doing what he always does. He is finding the people closest to the threshold of the valley, the people whose dignity the social system had not yet fully recognized. And he is placing them in the center of the frame, in the place of highest honor, and asking everyone around him to look again. This is the pattern that runs through everything. It is not incidental. It is the spine of his ministry. To understand why Gehenna was so feared in the time of Jesus, not as a theological doctrine, but as a living, present, visceral fear, you have to hold two things together simultaneously. The first is the valley itself, the real place, the smoke and the fire and the smell and the history, the centuries of accumulated meaning that made that ravine southwest of Jerusalem the most charged piece of geography in the entire landscape of Judean consciousness. The place that began as a boundary marker and became a burning ground, and became the place of slaughter, and became, by the 1st century, both a physical refuse site and a symbol of ultimate exclusion so powerful that it needed no explanation. Everyone knew what it meant. Everyone carried it somewhere in their body. The second is the social system that the valley anchored. Because Gehenna was not only feared as a destination after death, it was feared as a logic that was already operating in the world of the living, already organizing who mattered and who did not, already determining whose hunger would be acknowledged and whose would be stepped over, whose name would be said aloud and whose would dissolve into silence. The fear of Gehenna in the time of Jesus was the fear of those two things collapsing together. The fear that the contempt you practiced in life, the small, daily, almost invisible acts of dismissal and exclusion and refusal, would find its final form in the place where the dismissed and excluded and refused had always ended up. The valley was a mirror, and the teaching of Jesus was the act of holding that mirror up. Consider what this meant for a specific kind of person in the crowds that gathered to hear him. Imagine a woman in a village outside Capernaum. Not a rich woman, not a woman connected by marriage to any man of standing, but a widow whose husband had died 3 years ago and whose sons were too young to provide the kind of social anchor that adult men provided in that world. She exists in the community, but at its margins. She is present at the well, present at the market, present at the synagogue on the Sabbath. But she is present in the way that people are present when the world has not fully decided whether they are worth seeing. She has heard the stories about the teacher from Nazareth. The stories travel fast through the villages of Galilee. Stories about healings, about teachings, about confrontations with the Pharisees, in which the teacher somehow always finds the angle that makes the law serve the person rather than the person serve the law. She has heard that he spoke to the widow at Nain, that he raised her son. She does not fully know what to make of the stories, but she has heard them. And now she is in the crowd on the hillside, and the teacher is speaking about Gehenna, about the fire that waits for those who treat others with contempt, about the judgment that falls not on the obviously wicked, but on those who practice the ordinary, invisible, socially sanctioned exclusions that organize every community. She has been the object of that contempt. She knows what it feels like to be treated as someone whose presence does not fully register, whose need does not fully matter, whose future does not concern anyone with real power to shape it. She has felt, in her own daily experience, the logic of the valley. And the teacher is saying, with the authority of someone who understands the landscape in its full depth, who knows the valley and its history and its smell and its meaning, that this logic is not the final word, that the one who sees through the widow, who dismisses the child, who treats the poor man at the gate as furniture, that person is the one closest to the fire, not the one they have dismissed. The map has been redrawn, and for her, standing on that hillside with the wind coming up off the lake and the sound of the teacher's voice carrying through the crowd, something shifts. The earliest followers of Jesus did not leave behind systematic theological treatises about Gehenna. What they left behind was something more interesting, a set of practices, a way of organizing community, that directly inverted the social logic the valley represented. They ate together across lines that the social system maintained as absolute. Jew and Gentile at the same table, slave and free at the same table, the person of high honor and the person of no honor, sharing bread in the same room. The letter to the Galatians preserves what seems to be an early formula. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. And it reads not like an abstract spiritual declaration, but like a policy statement, like a description of an actual practice that someone had to fight to maintain against the constant pressure of the social world's gravitational pull toward hierarchy and exclusion. They cared for their dead. This sounds unremarkable until you remember what the alternative was. Until you remember that in a world where the valley waited, the act of burying one another was not a ceremony, but a declaration. We see you. You belong to us. You will not go to the valley. The Acts of the Apostles describes the early Jerusalem community selling property and distributing to anyone who had need, an economic arrangement so radical in the context of first-century Mediterranean society that scholars still debate whether it could have been sustained and for how long. But the impulse behind it is completely legible in light of everything the valley represented. If Gehenna was the place you ended up when no community had claimed you, then the deepest possible act of resistance to Gehenna's logic was to build a community that claimed everyone. That left no one at the gate. There is a phrase that appears in several of the gospel accounts, a phrase so simple that it is easy to read past it, that carries, in the light of everything the valley represented, an almost unbearable tenderness. It is the phrase, "He saw him. He saw Zacchaeus in the tree and called him by name. He saw the widow of Nain in her grief and had compassion. He saw the woman bent double in the synagogue and called her forward. He saw the blind beggar Bartimaeus when the crowd around him was trying to silence him, to return him to the invisible margins where people of his condition were supposed to remain. In a world where to be unseen was to be already halfway to the valley, where the logic of Gehenna operated through the eyes that looked past, the hands that did not reach, the voices that did not speak the name, the act of seeing was not incidental to the ministry of Jesus. It was the ministry. The fear of Gehenna in the first century was real, and it was deep, and it was written into the landscape and the smell of the city and the memory of the valley and the stories that parents told their children and the images that apocalyptic writers painted in language of fire and shadow and unquenchable burning. All of that was real. But the teaching of Jesus about Gehenna was not primarily a threat. It was a diagnosis, a precise, unflinching description of what human contempt looks like when it reaches its final destination. And alongside that diagnosis, inseparably woven into it, impossible to hear without also hearing, was the alternative, the practice of seeing, the refusal of the valley's logic, the kingdom that begins not in the clouds, but in the moment when one person turns toward another and does not look away. Jesus was not speaking from outside the human world about things that human beings could not understand. He was speaking from inside it, from inside the smell of the smoke and the weight of the valley and the knowledge of what it cost to be excluded and what it meant to be seen. He was speaking as someone who had walked along the edge of that ravine and knew every stone of it, and who was building, in the open air of Galilee and Judea, the only community that had ever genuinely threatened its power.